You know, it's kind of amazing when you think about it, but for like most of human history, the sort of really entrenched wealth inequality we see today, it just wasn't the norm.
It really wasn't. It seems that substantial, lasting wealth gaps only became a major feature in the last 5,000 years or so.
Which is pretty wild. And it immediately makes you ask, okay, so what happened? What changed?
Well, that's what's so fascinating. When we look back at the archaeology, specifically from hunter-gatherers and the very first farmers in Neolithic Western Eurasia, we're talking, roughly 11,700 to 5,300 years ago.
A huge stretch of time.
A huge stretch, exactly. And the picture is just different. Sure, there were differences in wealth sometimes, but they look more like temporary fluctuations, not the deep, persistent divides we see later.
Right. And that's exactly what we want to dig into in this deep dive, that whole journey towards enduring economic inequality. We're going to be looking at the clues people left behind,
Yeah, the archaeological record.
things like how big their houses were, did they have lots of storage space, what sorts of things were they buried with, that kind of stuff. Trying to piece together how wealth was spread out.
And you might be sitting there thinking, okay, old houses, burial goods, why does this matter now?
Exactly. But understanding these really, really deep historical roots, it can give you some surprising aha moments about why inequality feels so, well, sticky today.
And that raises a really key question. How do researchers even estimate something like wealth from just, stuff they dig up?
Good point. It's not like finding bank statements.
Not at all.
Yeah.
It really comes down to looking at those material things, houses, storage, grave goods, as sort of proxies,
Mm-hmm.
indicators of the energy, the resources, the labor people could command.
So a bigger house means more effort, more materials.
Right. More storage suggests maybe you could hold on to surplus food or goods.
Mm.
And fancy grave goods, things that were rare or hard to get, they might hint at someone's social standing, their access.
Okay. And then they use tools to measure the spread.
Yeah, they often use something called the Bocconi coefficient. It's basically a scale from 0 to 1. 0 means perfect equality, everyone has the same. 1 means total inequality. One person has everything. So it gives a numerical way to compare.
Makes sense.
But, and this is crucial, the researchers are usually very careful about the uncertainties. Archaeology isn't perfect. You don't always find everything, especially from the poorest people. So they have ways to account for that, statistically.
Right. So our mission here isn't really about finding the absolute first time someone had, I don't know, one more berry than their neighbor.
No, not quite. It's about the persistence.
That's the key word, isn't it? We're trying to figure out how those maybe small initial differences eventually grew into these really significant, long-lasting inequalities that have shaped, well, the last 5 millennia, especially after farming came along.
Because, as you said, the archaeology strongly suggests that while inequality did exist sometimes in those very early communities, it was generally milder. And it didn't seem to last.
Like blips on the radar.
Kinda, yeah. You get these occasional flashes, like the incredibly rich burials at Sungir way back in the late Paleolithic. Amazing finds. But they seem like exceptions, Not the rule. Not the start of some long-term trend.
Yeah, and figure 1 in the source material really shows this visually. It maps out estimates of wealth inequality in Western Eurasia over thousands of years.
And you see it. Relatively low, kind of bouncing around.
Right, until much later, late Neolithic, and especially into the Bronze Age. That's when the graph really starts to climb consistently. Before that, mostly flat with some bumps.
It's also really important to remember something the sources point out. What we can measure, house size, storage, pots, beads, might not have been the main thing people cared about back then.
Good point. Like maybe having a big family or strong social connections or being a skilled hunter.
Exactly. Those could have been much more important for your actual standing or well-being in the group than just having, say, a slightly bigger hut. So low material wealth inequality doesn't automatically mean everyone was equal in every single way.
Okay, so that leads us to the big puzzle, right? Farming starts, people can potentially produce more food, maybe store it. So why didn't we see big, lasting wealth gaps appear much, much sooner? What was holding it back for thousands of years?
That really is the core question. And one idea that comes up, which is pretty compelling,
Mm.
is this concept of, well, it's been called aggressive egalitarianism.
Aggressive egalitarianism sounds
It
intense.
does, yeah. But the idea is it wasn't just a passive state of everyone being roughly equal. It implies active social strategies, norms, behaviors,
Hmm.
things communities did to deliberately prevent anyone from accumulating too much wealth or power over others, like a social immune system almost.
Huh. Okay, so before we dive deeper into that, let's just quickly map out the main types of factors researchers think generally influence inequality in any society. The literature seems to group them, right?
Yeah, broadly speaking, there are maybe three big buckets. The first is technology and ecology.
Okay, what falls in there?
Things like,
Yeah.
can resources be easily stored? Grain stores better than, say, fresh meat? Can wealth actually be passed down easily? Is land fertile and abundant or scarce? How easy is it for elites to control or tax resources?
Right. And that old idea, the Ingalls-Morgan hypothesis about agricultural surplus being the key driver,
Right.
it fits here.
It does, yeah. It's part of that technology ecology picture. But as we'll see, it's not the whole story by a long shot.
Okay, bucket number 2.
Institutions and politics. This is about
Yeah.
power structures. Can elites actually enforce their rule? Can they extract resources through taxes or tribute? Does the society have things like organized states, slavery, frequent warfare? How are finances, if any, set up?
Got it. Power and control.
Pretty much.
Okay.
And the third bucket is culture and ideology.
So beliefs and values.
Exactly.
Hmm.
What are the shared social norms about wealth? Is being rich seen as good, bad, or just? Irrelevant. Are there formal ideologies, maybe religious or political, that justify inequality? And interestingly, has the society kind of lost the ability to even imagine things being different?
Wow. Okay. And the key thing is these three often work together, don't they? They reinforce each other.
Absolutely. Technology might create potential, but institutions and culture often determine whether that potential for inequality is realized and sustained.
Okay, so back to the timeline. Before this big shift in the Bronze Age, we see these societies that flirted with inequality, but it didn't stick. Let's look at some of those moments.
There are fascinating case studies. Take the late Paleolithic mammoth hunters, way back on the Russian plain.
Okay.
At some sites, like one called Mezin, the way they arranged their storage pits, it hints that maybe some households were accumulating more than others. One dwelling there had this incredible stash of portable art, ivory carvings, exotic jewelry.
Wow. So signs of difference.
Signs of difference, yes.
Yeah.
But it seems like it might have been temporary. At other sites from the same period or even different phases at the same site, the evidence points back towards more quality, more mobility.
Yeah.
It fluctuates.
Okay, another example.
How about Neolithic Thailand? At a site called Ban Non Wat. Here, it looks like some early elites might have popped up by capitalizing on new long-distance trade routes.
Ah, trade. That often creates winners and losers.
It can, yeah. Especially if it requires some initial investment like resources to get trade goods, or if there are advantages to operating at a larger scale. That could create a temporary gap.
And then there were the Chumash, right, in California.
Yes, on the Channel Islands. A really interesting case. Inequality seems to rise there, linked to control over exchanging prestige items. And that control was tied directly to owning these special plank canoes.
The canoes were key.
They were. They were complex, expensive to build and maintain,
Right.
not something everyone could afford. So whoever controlled the canoes essentially controlled access to certain trade networks and prestige goods. It's like controlling a key technology.
Parallels to today, maybe? Access to certain platforms or tech?
You could certainly draw parallels, yeah. And one more quick one. Provadia, near the Black Sea in Bulgaria.
What was their story?
Salt. They got wealthy producing and trading salt, processed into standardized ingots. They even built big fortifications around their site.
Suggests they had something worth protecting.
Definitely. But again, this period of heightened wealth and apparent inequality doesn't seem to have been sustainable in the long run. Maybe internal pressures, maybe external competition. It eventually changed or declined.
So the common thread in all these pre-Bronze Age cases is instability, fragility.
That seems to be it.
Yeah.
These moments of greater inequality happened, but they didn't lead to the kind of entrenched generation after generation wealthy class that becomes common later. They were somehow kept in check or just couldn't sustain themselves.
Okay, so let's flip that. What's the evidence for the absence of sustained inequality during this long stretch, the late Paleolithic and early Neolithic?
Well, you look at cultures like the Natufian, right before the Neolithic really kicks off in the Middle East. Archaeologically, there just aren't clear signs of inherited social rank or major wealth differences.
And specific sites.
Abu Hurairah is a great example, a big early farming village. But The houses are pretty similar. The burials are pretty similar across the community. It really suggests a more egalitarian setup without a strong, lasting hierarchy or evidence of large-scale trade creating big wealth gaps.
So it really does sound like, as you mentioned earlier, people might have been actively pushing back against wealth concentration. What kinds of things did they do? What were these aggressive egalitarian practices?
Well, there seems to be a whole toolkit they might have used. Mortuary rituals are one area. Often you see a lack of fancy grave goods. Burials are quite uniform.
Everyone gets the same treatment, basically.
Pretty much. Or practices like secondary burials, where maybe skulls are collected later and kept together communally. That emphasizes the group over the individual.
Interesting. What else?
Communal activities around food. At some early sites, like Jerf el Amar in Syria, there's evidence for shared production, shared consumption, maybe even shared storage early on. That naturally levels things out. Although, over time, things did tend to shift towards more household-based systems.
Right. And Satahoyuk in Turkey, that famous early town, is often cited here, isn't it, as aggressively egalitarian.
It is, and it's fascinating because they clearly had private property. People lived in separate houses. But there seems to have been this really strong social emphasis on sharing.
How do we know?
Things like evidence for large-scale communal feasting, possibly a way to redistribute food and resources, and even potential evidence for deliberate destruction of things that could become inheritable wealth, like grinding stones being broken or worn down completely before being discarded.
Wow. Deliberately destroying potential capital.
It seems like it, yeah. Preventing accumulation. Now, inequality did increase a bit at Saddlehoyuk over its very long occupation.
So it wasn't perfectly static?
No, but the Gini coefficients, calculated from house sizes while showing an increase, still remain relatively low compared to what we see later.
Yeah.
And eventually the site was abandoned. So even there, the egalitarian ethos, while perhaps weakening, seems to have persisted for a long time.
And weren't there other structural things, like how land was owned?
Absolutely. In many early farming societies, especially those using hoes rather than plows, land, the key resource was often held by larger groups, like lineages or clans, not by individuals.
Ah, so you couldn't just accumulate vast personal estates and pass them down?
Exactly. That structure itself limits intergenerational wealth transfer. Plus, things like those big funeral feasts we mentioned, or practices like bride wealth payments. These could also act to circulate wealth within the community rather than letting it concentrate.
So this aggressive egalitarianism, researchers have tried to model this too, right, with computer simulations.
They have, yeah, using agent-based models. They simulate populations with strong egalitarian norms where maybe sharing is valued and hoarding is frowned upon.
And what do the models show?
They show that even with those norms, you might get occasional spikes of inequality just by chance, or if one individual or family is particularly successful for a bit. But
That doesn't last.
exactly. The model suggests these spikes are likely to be temporary because groups that maintain more cooperation and sharing tend to be more resilient and outcompete groups where wealth becomes highly concentrated and potentially causes internal friction.
Which kind of matches the archaeological picture. Low average inequality, but with those occasional temporary bumps we talked about earlier.
Precisely. The models help make sense of that pattern.
Okay, so if early farming itself, and even these early large villages, didn't automatically trigger lasting inequality, and societies had ways to push back, what finally tipped the scales? What was the game changer?
The evidence increasingly points towards a major shift in agricultural technology, specifically the widespread adoption of the ox-drawn plow, particularly becoming common in the Bronze Age.
The plow. Okay, why was that so important?
Because it fundamentally changed the economics of farming. Think about early Neolithic farming with hand tools like digging sticks or hoes. The main limitation is labor, how many people you have to work the land. It's labor limited.
Got it. You need hands.
Right. But with an ox-drawn plow, a single family can cultivate vastly more land. Suddenly, the main limitation isn't labor anymore, it's land. How much suitable land you can get access to and control. It becomes land limited.
Ah, okay, so the value shifts.
Dramatically. Land becomes much more valuable, and so does the capital needed to work it, the oxen, the plow itself. These become critical assets. Human labor, relatively speaking, might even become less valuable, potentially creating a surplus of workers.
So how does that directly fuel inequality?
Well, if land is scarce and valuable, those who manage to control larger tracts of land and own the oxen and plows to work it have a massive advantage. They can produce much more surplus.
And potentially hire the people who don't have land or oxen.
Exactly. It creates the conditions for a landowning elite and potentially a dependent class of laborers who have little choice but to work for them. This allows for much greater wealth accumulation at the top.
And is there data to back this up? This link between plow agriculture or land-limited systems and inequality?
Yes, quite a bit. If you look at ethnographic data studies of different farming societies around the world and historical records, there's a strong correlation.
Table 2 and Figure 3 in the source material show this, right?
They do. Societies relying on plow agriculture or other land-intensive systems like irrigation tend to have significantly higher Gini coefficients, meaning more inequality than societies relying on hoe agriculture. The estimated increase in Gini associated just with that shift is quite substantial.
And the Thailand example fits here too,
Yeah.
with irrigation.
Yes, that seems to be another check. In Thailand, the adoption of irrigation, which, like the plow, makes land itself more productive and valuable, also seems to correlate archaeologically with an increase in wealth inequality markers.
So this technological shift didn't just change who owned what. It sounds like it might have made societies more precarious and made inheritance more important.
That seems to be part of the package, yes. When you shift to relying more heavily on land and maybe population density increases, societies might become more vulnerable to shocks like droughts or crop failures affecting that primary resource. Collective risk sharing might break down.
And inheritance.
Well, land and livestock, unlike maybe just your personal skill as a hunter, are highly inheritable forms of wealth. So when these become the basis of the economy, the ability to pass wealth down through generations becomes much more powerful in locking in advantages and disadvantages.
So inequality becomes stickier across generations.
Exactly. And some analyses decomposing the rise in inequality suggest that both factors were important. Increased exposure to wealth shocks and increased intergenerational transmission of that wealth. They both contributed significantly.
Okay, so the plow and the shift to land-limited farming created the potential, the conditions, for much greater and more lasting inequality. But technology wasn't acting in a vacuum, was it? What about political changes?
Absolutely critical. Technology wasn't the whole story. The next major piece of the puzzle seems to be the development of more centralized political structures, what the researchers sometimes call archaic proto-states.
Proto-states, like early starts.
Sort of, yeah. Think of them as a step beyond small kin-based villages or chiefdoms, but not yet the fully bureaucratic, impersonal states we might think of later in history. They often still relied heavily on kinship ties, personal loyalty, maybe lacked a complete monopoly on violence.
So powerful rulers, but maybe not absolute control everywhere yet.
Exactly. Think of early Mesopotamia, maybe some early Egyptian polities. These often went through cycles of centralization and fragmentation. Power could be contested, but they represented a significant increase in the concentration of political power compared to earlier Neolithic societies.
And how did these proto-states affect inequality?
They essentially provided the political framework to protect and enforce the wealth inequalities that the new agricultural system made possible. Elites could use their political power to secure land rights, extract taxes or tribute, suppress dissent, and generally make it harder for others to challenge their accumulated wealth. They helped make inequality durable.
So technology created the potential, politics helped lock it in.
That's a good way to put it. And we see this in the data too. Figure 1 again and Figure 6 in the sources, they show another marked jump in estimated wealth inequality associated with the emergence of these archaic proto-states, even compared to other land-limited societies that didn't have that level of political centralization.
But it wasn't always a one-way street, right? People sometimes resisted this concentration of power.
Oh, definitely. History is full of examples. The sources mention Tlaxcalan in Mexico, which famously resisted Aztec domination and maintained a more republican structure. So state formation wasn't inevitable or always successful.
Right. So it's clear the rise of states and the technological shifts were tangled together.
Very much intertwined, yes. It's hard to fully separate their effects.
Okay, let's just circle back quickly to a question we touched on. Why the delay? If farming started way back, why didn't it immediately cause this level of inequality? Why did states take so long to form?
It's a great question to reinforce. The simple answer is that the potential for surplus created by early farming didn't automatically translate into entrenched hierarchy. Managing those early, often quite large Neolithic villages without strong central authority must have been incredibly challenging.
Lots of negotiation, maybe.
Likely. And the early forms of leadership or social differentiation that did exist probably weren't powerful enough to consistently enforce large-scale, lasting inequalities against the egalitarian norms that seem to have been prevalent.
And those big early buildings weren't necessarily palaces?
Right. Many researchers interpret them more as communal ritual spaces or meeting houses, places that reinforced group identity rather than residences of powerful kings or queens. State formation itself seems to have been a very gradual, often contested process unfolding over millennia. It wasn't an overnight switch.
Okay, so let's try and wrap this up. If we were to summarize the key takeaways from this deep dive into the really long-term origins of economic inequality.
I think the main points are, first, for a very long time, in hunter-gatherer and early farming societies, significant and lasting wealth inequality was actually quite rare. It seems communities had ways, maybe these aggressive egalitarian practices, to keep it in check.
Right, it was unstable, episodic.
Exactly. Then, the big turning point seems to be the technological shift towards land-intensive farming, especially the ox-drawn plow becoming widespread in the Bronze Age.
Because that made inheritable wealth, land, and capital like oxen much more important than just labor.
Precisely. It created the economic conditions for much larger and more persistent wealth gaps to open up. And finally, the rise of early states, these archaic proto-states.
They provided the political muscle.
Yeah, they provided the political structures that helped solidify these inequalities, protect elite wealth, and make the disparities endure across generations. Technology, institutions, and maybe shifting cultural norms all played a part.
It really is fascinating to see how these deep historical processes unfolded over such vast timescales. It definitely gives you a different perspective on inequality today, doesn't it? It's not just about modern economics or politics.
It really underscores the deep roots, but it's also important for you, the listener, to remember the nature of the evidence. We're interpreting archaeological remains, right?
There are always uncertainties.
Always. Different researchers might interpret things differently. Comparing data across vastly different times and places is complex, and we often rely on analogies with more recent societies, which has its own challenges. It's an ongoing field of research.
Absolutely. So maybe a final thought to leave everyone with. If a technology like the plow, which surely seemed like a great innovation for producing more food, played such a key role in inequality taking root.
Where are you going with this?
Well, it makes you wonder, doesn't it? What seemingly beneficial technologies or social changes happening now might have unforeseen consequences for wealth distribution down the road. And perhaps what lessons, if any, could we still learn from those ancient societies that actively worked to maintain a degree of egalitarianism?
That's a really provocative question. Thinking about the long-term social impact of innovation and whether those ancient impulses towards leveling still resonate. Definitely something to chew on. Maybe it's worth you looking into some of the current research on technology's impact today, or even more about those Neolithic communities.
Food for thought indeed. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.